Joe Biden participated in some war crimes last night by authorizing a strike on what is being called Iranian-backed militias in Syria. And let's be clear, this is a war crime. Offensively attacking a country that did not attack you is considered an act of aggression and an act of war and a war crime under international law. So let's be clear about that, because that part isn't being talked about in any news report that I've seen on the topic. And more than that, this was unconstitutional. Contrary to popular belief in this country, that's especially been prevalent over the last 20 plus years, the president of the United States isn't emperor, god, king of the world. He doesn't get to do whatever he wants, whenever he feels like. He doesn't get to just drop bombs in any country he feels like. In the Constitution, it explicitly says that in order for a president to declare war on a country, and this is a declaration of war, to be bombing, to invade a country's airspace and drop bombs in another country, that's a declaration of war. And to do that, you need the approval of Congress. So I'm not saying that this is the argument this is the hill to die on, but because there are a lot of Democrats who are using this line of attack or criticism against Joe Biden. Oh, why didn't you get congressional approval? And again, my main criticism is the fact that this was an act of aggression and a war crime. But I do think that the unconstitutionality of it does have some importance, because unlike the warmongers in the Democratic Party who are saying, oh, why didn't you just ask for our approval? They're saying that because they would have granted him the congressional approval to do those airstrikes. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because that part isn't even up for debate. You needed the approval from Congress. You didn't get the approval from Congress. That makes this airstrike unconstitutional. That makes it illegal. And it makes this an impeachable offense. So Joe Biden, the Democrats in the House, should be preparing articles of impeachment, or at the very least, an impeachment inquiry to investigate this. And I'll get into the impeachment part of this later on in the video, but first I'm going to provide some context and debunk some of this State Department, CIA, Pentagon propaganda that's just being blasted by the mainstream media on this specific topic. The justification that the Biden administration is using for doing these airstrikes is the fact that in Iraq, there were attacks on either U.S. defense contractors and military personnel by different militant groups on the ground in Iraq. I believe the last rocket strike was maybe 2 weeks ago. The Biden administration is saying that the airstrike was in retaliation to those missile strikes. And that's a very important detail, because the only exceptions to the rule in the Constitution that requires the president to get congressional approval for military action is if it's in defense of U.S. personnel. And the Biden administration, just like every other administration before, is trying to interpret this in the most broad way imaginable, and saying that this airstrike in Syria 2 weeks later, and by the way, against a group that wasn't even a group that attacked the U.S. personnel in Iraq. This is some Iranian-backed group that they're alleging has ties to the other group, and they're doing that to send a message that you can't be supporting people that attack U.S. personnel. And they're saying that this is defensive. But that's not how I view defensive, for several reasons. The most narrow reason why this isn't defensive, in my opinion, of the situation is because how is it defensive if the missile strike was 2 weeks ago. Now, if at the moment, the attack was underway and Joe Biden gave the orders to do an airstrike in that specific moment against people who were attacking U.S. personnel, that would be one thing, because you can say that is in defense of U.S. personnel. Okay, but 2 weeks later, and in the statements that they've been giving to the press, they're saying it's to send a message. Okay, so you're making two different contradictory points. Is it defensive, which is the only way you could possibly do such an airstrike without congressional approval? Is it defensive, or is this retaliation and to send a message for for missile strikes that happened 2 weeks ago? Because retaliation and defense are very different things. To the more broader point in general about how you can't even really call this defensive, we have been illegally occupying Iraq, massacring civilians for over 17 years now. We have illegally invaded their country since back in 2003, accusing them of having anything to do with the 9/11 attacks, which they clearly did not, and there was absolutely no evidence at the time to suggest that they did. We went into their country under false pretenses, did an illegal occupation, responsible for the deaths of possibly 1 million civilians in Iraq, destroyed the infrastructure, created millions of refugees, destroyed entire communities, destroyed entire families, and we just refused to leave their country. And I believe it was over a year ago, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel the U.S. And over the years, it's become the relationship between the Iraqi government and the U.S. military has been complicated, because we've tried to turn it into a client state and put our puppets in control of the government. But still, the Iraqi people have been adamant that they don't want us in the country. And because of the escalation in violence around specifically the offense against ISIS and the massacre that we did in Mosul, Iraq, and in other places in Iraq, the resentment from the people on the ground, that the civilians in Iraq has reached a boiling point to where the parliament has decided to break ties in something that I didn't even expect, decided to break ties with the U.S. and voted to expel us over a year ago. And still, the Trump administration refused to leave, and now the Biden administration refuses to leave. So we're just saying we're going to occupy your country indefinitely, steal your natural resources, massacre civilians, and destroy just your infrastructure. So when people in that country take up arms and attack U.S. personnel in Iraq, it's hard to say that they're the aggressors in that situation, because we went all the way across the world and are occupying their country, destroying their country, and people are retaliating against that. That's why they're attacking U.S. personnel. So it's hard to say any retaliation against an attack that from Iraqi militants. It's hard to say any retaliation is in defense, because by definition you're there offensively, you're the aggressor, and your military actions aren't really defensive. They're part of this overall offensive occupation. And then back to the airstrike in Syria, that's even more of a reach and a stretch to try to call that defensive, because you're attacking a group in another country that wasn't even part of the attack. You're accusing them of being part of that initial attack. So it really is hard to adequately put into words how outrageous this entire situation is. Impeachment is definitely warranted in this situation. At the very least, an official impeachment inquiry. where Congress does an official investigation with subpoena power, the ability to call witnesses to testify under oath, and to request documents from the White House and from the Pentagon and from the CIA and anybody else who was involved, with the intent of figuring out whether or not this was constitutional. At the very least, there needs to be an impeachment inquiry, because there really needs to be some line in the sand, because we've just accepted that the president is just going to start wars whenever he feels like and drop bombs in countries wherever he feels like, and have not having to run this by anybody. We've kind of accepted that over the last 20 years, and that has led to an unmitigated disaster in the Middle East and all over Africa with this war on terror. This will be the third president to do illegal airstrikes in Syria, acts of war in Syria, killing people, most of the time civilians, on the ground in Syria without any congressional approval and no consequences when they do it without it. So are we going to pretend like the Constitution exists, or is this just going to be some authoritarian dictatorship where the president is Emperor God King and he's above all the laws and nobody can ever check him on his war powers? And another insane part about all of this is that isn't getting any airplay, isn't getting any coverage, is the glaring conflicts of interest, the financial conflicts of interest here. Because people are just acting as if, oh, was this defensive or was it not? Did he need congressional approval or did he not? And completely missing from the conversation is the fact that Joe Biden's defense secretary, the person in charge of the Pentagon, the person in charge of military operations, he was just sitting on the board of Raytheon. As he was being confirmed, he was an active board member of Raytheon, a defense contractor who makes billions of dollars off of the Syrian war. And on top of the fact that he was literally just sitting on the board of Raytheon, somebody who benefits from the continuation of this war and of these airstrikes, Lloyd Austin still has over $1 million in Raytheon stock. And when the Trump administration did similar airstrikes in Syria, they used missiles from Raytheon, and that caused the stock of Raytheon to shoot through the roof. I believe it was $5 billion the stock price of Raytheon went up when Trump did similar airstrikes in Syria. One, because of the free advertisement that everyone talking about the Raytheon missiles that were in the airstrike. And then on top of that, the U.S. has to buy back those bombs, has to replenish those bombs that they just dropped. So that means more defense contracts for Raytheon. So it's as transactional, it's as gross as you can possibly imagine, the war profiteering. And you really mean to tell me that the fact that there was so much money to be made personally from Lloyd Austin if these airstrikes were conducted in Syria, you mean to tell me that it's all a coincidence and none of that factored into the decision to do those airstrikes last night? Like the saying goes, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. So the fact that Biden, on purpose, went out of his way to pick somebody with such glaring conflicts of interest as Lloyd Austin, and then what do you know? One of the first thing he does as defense secretary is ask for some airstrikes that would make him a lot of money. That's not a coincidence. That's further proof in Joe Biden's endless record of being a corrupt tool of his corporate donors. So you mean to tell me that the president of the United States can do military actions at the behest of his corporate donors, and that's not an impeachable offense? I'm noticing with the Democrats the very few who've even said anything about this, they're all tiptoeing, or I haven't heard a single one of them mention impeachment. Some of them say they question the legality of these strikes, and they question whether it was constitutional and whether he needed congressional authorization. I haven't heard anybody call for an impeachment inquiry, which is designed for specific moments exactly like this. And it leads to question, why aren't they? Because when it was Trump, okay, they didn't try to impeach him over war crimes and things like that, granted. But when Trump did something that got their riches up in a bunch, like when he made that phone call to the Ukrainian president and they impeached him the first time, look how committed they were to that. Created a whole national spectacle around it because Trump refused to give weapons to the Ukrainian government to fund a proxy war unless he did an investigation into Biden's corruption in Ukraine, which, by the way, is a real story. And there is real Biden corruption in Ukraine. But because of that, the Democrats' hair was on fire, and they acted like the president is so lawless, he's so out of control, we need to impeach him immediately. He's a grave threat to the Constitution. He's a grave threat to this country. Where's that same energy when the president does, it looks like he's engaged in some of the most vile, corrupt actions that a president can possibly do, continue endless war, do military actions for the profit of defense contractors, his corporate donors. Where is that same let's start these impeachment inquiries immediately? Let's look into that, and if this is what it looks like, we need to impeach Biden. Where's that same energy? And that was why none of the times they've tried to impeach Trump, it all rang hollow to me, and it came off as just rank political theater. Because the presidents violate the Constitution in egregious ways every single day. And it's Congress's job to act as a check. It is their job in the Constitution to be a check on the executive branch and to impeach a president when he does something illegal or unconstitutional. But they let shit slide all the time. But the shit that they choose to get outraged about, and the only times they've ever tried to impeach him, any president in my lifetime, only time the Democrats ever tried to impeach any of the war criminals is when Trump did something to slight them personally. When he slights the elites in the Democratic Party, that's the only time the actions of the president rise to impeachment. The first time, he wanted an investigation into their dear leader, Saint Joe Biden, and because of that, they impeached him over it. And the second time was over the riot, and because his supporters stormed the Capitol and made them feel uncomfortable, they felt like that crossed the line, and again, demanded the historic step of impeaching a president twice, even though he was already out of office. So like all of this impeachment and shit like that, it never animated me. It never got me excited. I didn't even watch any of the impeachment. And that sounds crazy for somebody who follows politics. But I had no interest in it because it was just all self-aggrandizing, self-serving political theater for the establishment, for the elites in the Democratic Party. Because at the end of the day, we know that they have no intention of holding the president accountable when they break the law or when they violate the Constitution. Or else they would have impeached George Bush for starting the Iraq War, or many of the war crimes that he committed while he was there and covering up them. They would have impeached him for all of that. They would have impeached him for starting an illegal international torture network where the CIA was kidnapping people from around the world, sending them to secret black site prisons and torturing them. That's wildly unconstitutional and illegal and worth impeachment. They didn't impeach him over that. They didn't impeach Obama when he started 7 or 6 different wars around the world in Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Niger, Libya. All of those were illegal. All those were unconstitutional. All those merited impeachment, but they didn't. And this instance of Joe Biden doing this illegal airstrike in Syria, and again, it's so hard to even describe how outrageous this all is, because you have the defense secretary who will make a killing from these airstrikes, make out like a bandit from these airstrikes personally, financially. And then you have him telling the president, oh, you definitely need to do this. Even though it's illegal, even though it's unconstitutional, even though they didn't get any authorization from Congress, even though Syria had absolutely nothing to do with the attacks. The defense secretary gives Biden this option. Biden says, yes, let's do it. And then he sends U.S. military jets, fighter jets, to violate the airspace of a sovereign country. And that alone is not a small thing. To have fighter jets, to have somebody's military come into your country's airspace uninvited, that alone is an act of war. Can you imagine if somebody did that to us? If China or Russia had fighter jets just flying into the United States airspace, first, they would have been shot down before they even made it into the United States. But so that gives you some kind of idea of how outrageous the action is. But we did it. We violated Syria's airspace, and then we dropped bombs in their country, killing people who, again, had nothing to do with the initial attack. And everybody's going to act like this isn't an impeachable offense. So this is ridiculous. And then I'm going to do an entirely separate video about the media reaction to this, and also the reaction of the Justice Democrats and the so-called elected progressives in Congress. They're supposed to be leading the charge on issues like this. They're supposed to be the anti-imperialist, anti-interventionists. They're supposed to be the advocates for peace and against the endless wars. So you'd expect them to come out with a forceful denunciation of Joe Biden for these war crimes and for this unconstitutional airstrike in Syria. But they put out, the few of them who've even said anything, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, Ro Khan, put out their statements, weak sauce. And that's a whole entire separate video by itself. But I just wanted to explain the situation, give my thoughts on the situation about this airstrike, and then I'll do an entirely separate video about, like I said, the media reaction and the reaction from other Democrats in Congress whose job it is to be leading impeachment over this.